Great. So good morning to everybody in Tokyo, and good night or good evening to everybody in the States. We are very happy to have this kind of very important discussion today here. And I'm Christian Schmitz, and I'm moderating this together with Trista Bridges. We have Motoko here in Tokyo, we have Lolita Jackson in New York, and we have Jeff Bennett, who is correspondent in the White House. He's in Washington, D.C. What time is it in Washington right now?
It is 8:02 p.m.
Okay, so it's basically the same like in Washington, in New York. Good, so let me just give a little bit of a framework how this all came together. Quite a while ago, when the turmoil in Minneapolis started, I got up in the morning, I saw the news, and I was thinking, why the hell is all this happening in the 21st century? And I was looking into the Declaration of Independence. I read the Declaration of Independence. I'm German, so I don't know very much about the US and its history, but I'm very curious and I want to know about things. And I remembered that 1963, there was this speech by Martin Luther King, I Had a Dream, and that's already almost 50 years ago. And I watched the speech and I was really fascinated by how he spoke and how he actually didn't say that we the black people or they the white people. He said everybody and all of us should come together, and that was his dream. And then we are in the 21st century, and right now we have a Black Lives Matter campaign. So in my naivety, I just posted this speech together with a headline, which was "All Lives Matter." And I didn't know at that stage that there were some people who were harshly criticized about this. And then a very, very heated up discussion came up on Facebook. And Trista, who is also in sustainability here in Tokyo, I'm in sustainability as well. We met and we thought we should do something, and we should have a discussion with some people who are closer to this, what happened. And then we bring in our communities, and we have them also give us an insight about how these things are happening in the US, how these things are happening from the viewpoint of politics, how these things are happening from the viewpoint of media. And here we are today. And I would like to introduce Lolita Jackson. She is in the New York Mayor's office. She's an advisor for climate policy. And maybe you can afterwards introduce yourself a little bit more in detail. And Trista will introduce the other two panelists right now.
Hi, I'm Trista Bridges. As Christian said, I'm also working in the sustainability space, and I live here in Tokyo. And so we're very happy to have as well Motoko, who is the New York Times bureau chief. And she's actually worked with the New York Times for a very long time, since 2003, I believe, correct? So that's 17 years. And as you probably, anyone who lives here in Tokyo probably follows her work. We also have Jeff Bennett from NBC News, who's the White House one of the White House correspondents, I should say, for NBC News. And he's joining us from his home, just outside Washington, I believe. And thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us today. And so as Christian said, we wanted to spend some time talking about this issue and to get some, I guess you could say, direct information from people who are on the ground about what's going on, right? And we're in a very turbulent time in many capacities, right? We have COVID-19, which is really devastating many communities, causing many challenges to countries around the world. And on top of that, particularly in the US, we have this issue around race, which has obviously gone on since the dawn of the country, but continues today. So what I'd like to do is start with Jeff. And Jeff, you're obviously on the front lines of this as in the media every day. And what I'd like to do is ask kind of two questions. The first one is, can you help those who are on the phone today understand, or on the call, I should say, understand what's going on? Where are we now in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and just the movement for racial justice? Where are things at the moment? How is this connecting with all the other challenges that we have at the moment around COVID-19? And then from that, we'll continue the discussion. So can you give us a bit of context on that first to start?
Yeah. I guess I'll start by saying that the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the protests we've seen since the end of May, following the police killing of George Floyd, we haven't seen a significant political result from that yet in terms of, I should say, policy. We haven't seen a significant policy results in terms of that, but we have seen a huge cultural response. So, companies, for instance, now taking Aunt Jemima off of the bottles of syrup here in the States. The NFL, Washington's NFL team, changing its name away from the Redskins. The NASCAR banning the Confederate flag. The U.S. military banning the Confederate flag from its military bases. And I think one of the reasons why the killing of George Floyd resonated differently in ways that other instances where police have killed Black and brown women and men, one of the things that's different about it is, one, that it happened in the throes of a pandemic where everyone was at home. And so, there were captive audiences to the nonstop media coverage of it. That had never happened before. And what's also different is that we also have a president who routinely uses race-baiting rhetoric to appeal to his core supporters. And I think that had a compounding effect. And so you had Americans who probably never really engaged with issues of race and racial justice, having really no choice but to. And so this is borne out in polling data. People who now have a favorable view of Black Lives Matter because they see it as a basic statement of equity and not some sort of insurgent threat where they might have seen it that way previously. This is a movement that was really born from a hashtag following the killing of Trayvon Martin and but his killer who was not found guilty. And so it started as a hashtag. And interestingly enough, Kristen, to your point about, why is saying all lives matter offensive to so many? And I completely understand that. It seems to say that would seem like it would be fairly innocuous and inclusive, but it strikes people who support Black Lives Matter as being delegitimizing, right? So that this is a very basic statement, Black Lives Matter, and then to say all lives matter, the implicit suggestion is that you're saying that Black lives don't. And so that's one of the reasons why, statements like that can be taken differently than the way they're intended.
Okay. And I had one question around just the evidence and the proof. So I think when a lot of people, I know in my life, when people see me, right, they say, well, you're successful, you've gone to these wonderful schools, you have a great job, you seem to be fairly financially stable. They might take that as an implication that there isn't a problem, right, in terms of equity and justice around Black and brown people in the United States. I'm curious as to, just in the media, what are some things that you've seen that prove and illustrate that this is a problem, that this is still a problem today in 2020? I mean, I have my own factoids, but I'm curious as to some of the things that you've seen.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact that I think a lot of the gatekeepers and decision makers and tastemakers are largely white. Just in my line of work, in cable television, starting Monday, you'll have the first female Black anchor in prime time. It's now 2020, and this is a first now happening. Yeah. And so, and even in terms of representation on camera and behind the scenes, news organizations do not look like behind the scenes a reflection of the country that they serve, and that has a lot to do with pattern matching, right? So you have bosses who hire people. They hire people from the same schools. They hire people who remind them of themselves. Like it's a systemic issue, and I think news organizations have done a better job than they have done before in realizing it's a problem and taking steps to be intentional about addressing it. But I think you can find in every aspect of American life the ways in which inequity, systemic racism is borne out.
Okay. Interesting. And let's talk a little bit about you just for a second. So obviously you're a Black man living through this very crazy time. I'm just going to say crazy. How is it affecting you? You know, and just on a personal level.
Yeah, you know, as a journalist, I think we all do a fairly good job of compartmentalizing.
Yeah.
So you know, I'm not fully engaged with the way it affects me because I don't really take that much time to think about it. I think one of the things that I'm intentional about, especially in covering this president, is having my ear attuned to the things that he is saying that what people used to call, you know, dog whistles. I think now people have a better sense of, you know, when the president, for instance, yesterday, now he's focused on what he calls preserving the suburbs. And he used the phrase, you know, you never know who's going to move into your neighborhood and bring down your home value. So in a lot of ways, he's putting down the dog whistle and picking up the bullhorn. But earlier in the administration, he would say things that, you know, I would be very attuned to what he was saying, the message that he was trying to convey, where others weren't. And I felt like that was a sort of an extra responsibility that I had to bear that out in the reporting.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that dog whistle that you mentioned about home values, you know, my family moved into a predominantly white suburb in 1978. And even at that time, they were trying to keep us out because they were worried about us bringing down their home values, right? So this is something that absolutely many people, as soon as it's said, they know exactly what's being said. So regardless of what side they are on in this particular issue. So Motoko, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about Japan. And as I mentioned, we were discussing before we started the call about how Motoko wrote a very good article about 2 weeks ago about how Japanese are perceiving the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you talk a little bit about that, Motoko, to give participants a bit of context?
Sure. So what's interesting about the response here in Japan, of course, Japan's most important ally in the world is the United States. Arguably, the world leader who has had the quote unquote best relationship with President Trump is Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Of course, the relationship goes all the way back to the American occupation of Japan. So there's sort of this very strong relationship. And then in sort of terms of soft power, like many countries, Japan looks to America for a lot of pop culture, so there's a total fascination with the United States. But I think in terms of how Japan observes problems in the United States or controversial issues in the United States, it's always something that's over there. And I think the recent protests and over Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's death are no different, that the Japanese public and certainly the Japanese media has characterized it as something other. And this was sort of most profoundly, tensively, and racist manifested in a video, a clip that NHK, which is sort of the equivalent of NPR or PBS in Japan, posted. It was sort of an anime version of their kind of characterization of the protests that were going on in Minneapolis and elsewhere in the United States and what had driven them. And they talked about inequality and anger over COVID. And then they had these pictures that were these sort of really racist caricatures. I think there's no other way to describe them than that, of, you know, overly muscular Black men in white tank tops and sort of violent images, not once mentioning police violence against the Black community. And so there was an outcry, primarily, I think, led by African Americans who live in Japan, but then sort of slowly followed by a progressive group on social media among the Japanese to have that taken down. But then there were a number of Black Lives Matter kind of solidarity marches that were organized, but almost all of them were organized by African Americans who live in Japan, so non-Japanese. The participation, there was Japanese participation, but most of them, generally, the people who participated in these marches had some kind of roots abroad. And so there's a sort of a sense in which race and racial strife is something that's viewed as something that comes from outside of Japan. But then on top of that, what I wanted to explore in the piece that I wrote was also about the way in which Japan itself has some issues of discrimination. And the Japanese will often say, there's sort of a majority opinion where it is said, Japan doesn't have racism, you know, by virtue of the fact that we are a homogenous nation, that most people here are of the same race, so we can't possibly have racism, which is of course a misnomer. But so I wanted to explore the ways in which Japanese people, even separate and apart for how they treat Blacks who come to live in Japan have issues with other marginalized groups. For example, ethnic Koreans who were either brought here forcibly or came looking for work during the Japanese occupation of Korea. To this day, if you are of Korean heritage and born in Japan, you are not automatically granted Japanese citizenship, even if you are like third or fourth generation. And often there are kind of, relatively right-wing groups that tend to be prejudiced against Koreans, but there still is this sort of casual racism or casual discrimination in Japanese society. And so I wanted to sort of explore the way in which Japan might take this opportunity not only to express solidarity, what they saw with going on in the United States, but also kind of look internally. And in talking to lots of people, including Japanese professors of ethnic studies and activists from different marginalized groups in Japan, they were saying they don't think that's yet happening. It wasn't happening before. This is probably not going to be a trigger for that happening, though we wish it were. That being said, there definitely, like when you look on social media, there was a lot of support. I mean, once the sort of the first movement or protest against that NHK video were initiated by people from the Black community in Japan, it seemed to me that there was a lot of following from Japanese progressives or supporters. And also there's sort of this issue of biracial children, of which I am one, of course, but particularly children who are biracial, Black parent and a Japanese parent, have suffered a lot of bullying as kids. And there was a Japanese baseball star who wrote about this quite vividly on Twitter and got a lot of outpouring of support from the Japanese community when he talked about how he was bullied as a child because he was half Black. And so I think there is sort of a slow awakening of consciousness. But having written about gender issues, I mean, I often feel this way in Japan, that a lot of the consciousness raising that was happening in the United States, say 30 years ago, is now just starting to happen in Japan.
Yeah.
Did you grow up in the States, actually, Motoko-san?
Yes, primarily. I spent 2 years in Japan when I was a kid, but yes, I was raised as an American.
And when you were in America, raised and growing up, did you face any kind of these racial issues as well, or you were more regarded?
I grew up predominantly in a suburb. Ironically, in Northern California, which is typically cast as this very progressive place. And if you go down to the Berkeley area, I was always so relieved because there were kids who looked like me. But in the particular community where I grew up, I was definitely an other. And, I got the whole like ching chong 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 ching and, Japanese Swiss cheese and the eyes raised and all of that kind of stuff happened when I was growing up, for sure.
Okay. Well, thanks certainly for sharing that. And Christian, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about sustainability in New York.
New York. I mean, Lolita, you have been in New York the whole time, I guess, and New York has been one of the hotspots in the beginning when COVID-19 started. So first of all, I already introduced you briefly, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you're doing right now, and then talk a little bit about the situation in New York, how it had been 3 months ago and how it is now. I think the situation is quite well under control right now, contrary to other parts of the nation in the US. And then because you are also into sustainability, and Trista had also posted this article on The Guardian this morning, where this relationship between the ethnic minorities and air quality and the deprivation, these kind of points, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this. Lolita.
Sure. So just to start out, my job is I'm the climate diplomat for New York City Mayor's Office. I've actually worked in Mayor's Office for 14 years. So I was here when Hurricane Sandy hit. I was here when the plane landed in the Hudson. Many of the different disasters and sort of stresses that have happened through New York City over time since 2006, I responded to, but there's really been nothing like this moment. I live about 4 blocks from where that tent hospital that you may have seen in Central Park for Mount Sinai was located. I live on the Upper East Side, very close to that. And at one point, because there was no traffic and there were no people going back and forth to work, because of actually where I'm located, all I heard was ambulances all the time. There was a day where 600 people within New York City borders died. 800 people within New York State borders died. And that was more than one day. And so you see the numbers for other places, and we dwarfed those by many times. And the thing that people don't also recognize is that a lot of the blame, or a lot of the sort of, most Black and brown people are getting it because of underlying conditions. It was really because we were the ones that had to go to work. Many people who are minorities in New York City have the jobs that were considered essential. So the people, when you had to go to the grocery store, when you needed to go to actually the hospital, the nurses and some of the physician assistants and other businesses that were considered essential, those folks had to go to work. And because of that, they were on the subways. We are a very, very densely populated place, as most of you know. We have 8.6 million people. Also, the households in most of those communities are much more densely populated within the household. So even though the Upper East Side, where I live, is more densely populated as a community, you either live in a studio apartment or you have your own bedroom. If you live in Corona, Queens, or if you live in other communities in Queens, you may have multi-generational households of 6 to 10 people in the same household. So what would happen is that one person who's an essential worker would have to go to work. They would bring it home, and everyone in the household would get it. And so the numbers that you were seeing at Elmhurst Hospital, a lot of those were driven by, unfortunately, those outcomes. So I do want to dispel for many people that, yes, while African-American and other communities do sometimes have underlying conditions of diabetes and heart problems and those sorts of things, it really was because those people had to go to work, whereas people like me could stay home and never go back to work until it was safe. So understand that that was something that really drove what was happening. We were at the head of the curve. Obviously, we were on the top of it very much earlier than everyone else. And so, we were sort of shunned by the rest of the country and the rest of the world. What's happened now is that it's largely in control here. The one worry that we have is actually, we have 60 million people come to New York City from other countries and other cities around the country during normal years. If we open up our borders and let people in, it's going to come back. People want to come here to see Broadway. They want to come to see live jazz. All those things that make New York what it is what drives people to come here. The second the borders get open, we're going to probably be under siege again with the cases. And so interestingly enough, we're in New York City and New York State trying to have that quarantine so that if you're from another place that may have a surge, we're trying to keep those folks out, which is the opposite of what happened in the beginning where people were trying to keep us out. So just to give you a sense of what's happening now, also we're being very careful. So phase 4 starts tomorrow, but that does not open inside of restaurants. It still doesn't open gyms. Still doesn't open movie theaters. So our phase 4 looks very different than other places around the country, around the world. We're being very, very cautious. But once we open the borders, we'll see what happens. But one thing I wanted to point out is that New York City's vibrancy, I feel, has been lost. The reasons that people are willing to tolerate small living spaces like my tiny studio apartment with no outdoor personal access is for going to Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I can walk to, Lincoln Center, Broadway, live jazz, the Blue Note, etc. All those things are gone. They're not here. They haven't been here for months. I've lived here 30 years. Now. Yes, I've lived here 30 years since I got out of college, and it reminds me of the dark days of the early 90s when I first moved here. We projected to have a $10 billion reduction in tax receipts for New York City's budget. That is a big hole. It'll take us some time to get anywhere near where we were before. And in addition, as I said, COVID-19 has hit the Black and brown communities much harder, as evidenced in the infection and death rates. So that effect was disproportionate to communities who are already dealing with other issues. We tend to be working at those jobs that can't be done at home, and thus it does have to go out when the virus is most virulent. So because of all of that, and the fact that the pandemic and the protests happen simultaneously, it's really been an amazing phenomenon to unpack. People are already angry and upset that their family members, I had 7 friends whose fathers have died, 7. And there's probably more who are very, very ill. And a lot of people have the same story. Younger people in particular that feel profoundly let down by the fact they had to lose their jobs, their family members were sick from this, and then Black Lives Matter happened. They hit the streets, they hit it hard. And for many of us, it really made us rethink our relationship to the city and our place in it, and I'm one of those people. So that's the answer to your first part. And the second, I'm going to turn more to my daytime job and my work. Climate justice is very important to New York City because we recognize that there's many years of environmental racism that will need to be undone, of bus depots being put in certain neighborhoods, brownfields and other environmental hazards that were placed in those communities of color. Policies, even seemingly as benign as where you plant trees. We had a 1 million trees policy. I've been here since the Bloomberg administration, the last 2 terms, and we had a 1 million trees program. That was great. But where you plant those trees can have cascading effects on those communities for decades. Both our One NYC 2015 and One NYC 2020 Green New Deal plans were constructed through an equity lens. So thinking through those communities of color and those income communities who needed more of those resources geared toward them to ensure that they experience the positive effects of the work that we're doing. So one example is there's a concept called urban heat island, where there's certain places that don't have enough trees or green space to really mitigate hot days like today in New York City and in DC, where it's 95+ degrees. So we decided to plant more trees in those particular neighborhoods and other mitigation effects like that. And we involve members of those communities in our decision-making through our Environmental Justice Advisory Board, where people who actually are in this movement or live in those communities can help advise what our actual policies are, such as discounted memberships and free bike helmets to low-income communities to encourage bicycle use. We also recognize that it's important to have them involved in our bad environmental outcomes and make them better in these conversations. And one example I want to end with is I look at a child who has asthma in East Harlem. So East Harlem is a community in New York City that is predominantly Latino or Puerto Rican in particular, and 50% of the children in that community have asthma because they are by the Tri-Borough Bridge. There's a big bus depot, there's sanitation garages, there's all sorts of mayhem that happens environmentally in that community because they were poor. 30% of that community is public housing. So it was a place to dump all the things you didn't want to have in the white communities. So what's happened now is half those children have asthma. So I look at a mother of a child in that community who has to take her kid out of school 2 days a month because he has asthma attacks. She misses work, the child misses school and has adverse outcomes because of that. She can't be involved in the civic life of her city. So for me, being involved in this work, growing up in public housing myself and poor, I want to help that mother be able to not have her child have asthma. So we have air quality that's better for her child, then she can contribute to her community. Her child can have better learning outcomes, and all those things come together. And that's why we do that work in New York City.
Thank you very much. And I also wanted to go back to when we met in Tokyo. The topic was actually resilience. And I think you at that time when you were in Tokyo, you did a brilliant lecture about how with resilience measures, you actually prepared New York for natural disasters. And maybe, I don't know if you were speaking about pandemics, but now we have from different angles, we have this kind of disasters coming in. So could you go into the retrospective and see how you, from the point of view of this resilience, you prepared for something like what's happening right now, and if you actually applied some of these learnings, and if there can be done even more for in the near future.
Sure. So as I said, I've been a little older than I'm looking, I'm 52. So I was in the mayor's office for 14 years. I have been in the mayor's office for 14 years. I had a whole other career in finance before that. But I was a person that was pretty instrumental in the post-Hurricane Sandy response. And Mayor Bloomberg at the time commissioned a study that 50 of us worked on called A Stronger, More Resilient New York. And it didn't just plan for the next Hurricane Sandy, it planned for urban heat island, it planned for sea level rise, it planned for food security. So you don't think about food, but half the food in New York City comes in one spot, Hunts Point Market, and it is in the floodplain. It happened, Hurricane Sandy was a tidal event, so it was low tide in the Bronx, but if it had been high tide, we wouldn't be able to get food. Another thing that really stuck out to me is that most of the mail for the Bronx comes into one spot in the Upper West Side, which was flooded during Hurricane Sandy. I had done some interviews of people around to figure out what the effects were for them. If all the mail comes in the Upper West Side and it is a place that's flooded, the storm happened on October 29th. At that point, people were still getting paper checks. So if you live in the Bronx and November 1st is 3 days later, you don't get your check, you can't eat. So we realized quickly that we had to make sure that either the mail was rerouted from that spot, or that we made those that particular spot more resilient so people could get their mail. So we recognized through the learnings of that we need to apply those lessons not just to a storm, but to moments like this pandemic. So we already had sort of an emergency operations center type of situation set up and tabletop exercises for things like this. And there actually had been tabletop exercises for pandemic response. So we were a little bit more ready than you would have thought because of that.
Thank you. I also wanted to maybe listen a little bit into what you as a private individual and when you were growing up, because you know I haven't been growing up in the States. I'm also not Black. I have had many conversations with my American friends who I have some Black American friends as well here in Tokyo, but I also have a lot of white American friends, and I asked both of them how they grew up and if they actually had a lot of interaction between Black and white people. And from most of my white people said, yeah, actually I don't remember really well, or yeah, there was one friend, but there were no close interactions, I think. So maybe I would be very curious to know about also each of your personal experiences. I also discussed this with Trista when we met. So please, could you give a little bit of insight into this?
Sure, I'll talk for a few seconds. As I said, I'm 52 years old. So I was actually the first class that was underwent busing in my town, which was in 1972. Many of you may have heard of the concept of busing, where there was a concept called redlining, where even if you were in a suburban town, there were places in that town that Black people were not given mortgages to live. So I lived in a suburb of New Jersey. I think, Motoko, you were from New Jersey as well, called Somerset, New Jersey, which is near New Brunswick, near a university town of Rutgers University. And there were executives from Johnson & Johnson, which their world headquarters were there, lived in my town. So they wanted to sort of keep them sequestered. So the white section of town was completely separate from the Black section of town, which means that the elementary school either was all Black or all white. So the first year I went in kindergarten, they decided to integrate that. You may have heard of something called the Boston bus riots, where when they wanted to integrate the schools in Boston, people actually rioted to keep Black students out of their schools. So my town didn't have riots, but people were not very happy that we were bused to their schools. So I was the first class of that. So while I did grow up in a mixed suburb, which was about 50%, 40% Black, the schools were very segregated until I started my first year going to them. And then they've obviously been desegregated since then. But that is really a situation that colors your experience going forward. We had teachers who didn't want us in their schools. We had children who did not want to be learning with us. I remember specifically in my 25th reunion from high school, a white male student said to me, you know, the teacher told my parents it was between you and me for the smartest kids in the school. That was never said to me. The reason it was said to him is that he must have been doing something wrong if I was doing as well as him. So I want to paint a picture for people how these adverse things that are said to you over time manifest themselves. And Trista, you'll understand this. When I applied to Ivy League schools, I was discouraged from doing so because they were hard to get into. And then when I got into Penn, Columbia, and Yale, I was then told I only got in because I was Black, even though I had better scores than the other students. So just know that this continued throughout my educational experience. So while I did grow up with white individuals and I had a mixed school, the educational experience was mixed because of that. But it made me ready to go to Penn because then I was ready for anything to happen to me at Penn and Trista. And I went to the same college, so she understands what I'm saying about this. So even if you grew up around other people who were other races, it still was sometimes difficult to navigate all of those things. And I'll just stop there.
Yes, and something I didn't put together is that all four of, well, myself and except Christian, all from New Jersey. So we all grew up in New Jersey. So Jeff grew up in New Jersey too. So can you tell us your experience too?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I am the beneficiary of the civil rights movement and of the busing that Lolita spoke to, and all of the great many sacrifices that our parents made, because I grew up in a neighborhood that was fully integrated. I mean, I went to a mostly white school, but it was diverse in the sense that there were a number of Asian Americans or a number of African Americans, not as many Latinos at the time, but that changed as I got older. You know, most Black kids don't have Black teachers until they're in high school, but by the time I got to high school, I had 3 Black teachers, one of whom was a Black man, which is also still rare in public education. And I grew up in Voorhees, New Jersey, so South Jersey, really a suburb more of Philadelphia than a suburb of New York, if you're not familiar with the region. South Jersey and North Jersey are oftentimes thought of as being almost two different states within one state.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so when it came time for me to figure out where I wanted to go to school, I chose to go to Morehouse College, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's an historically Black college, all-male institution. My brother went there and graduated 4 years before I had started as a freshman, and he did phenomenally well there, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to go. But I had a different experience than I think a lot of other Black men my age did in public schools, in the sense that, you know, it was sort of bucolic suburban life, and diverse. And, you know, I was class president 3 times in high school. So, you know, it was great. It's the kind of environment that I would want my son to grow up in.
Yeah. And I'll just say quickly, before we move to the next question about myself, I also grew up in New Jersey, a couple towns over from where Jeff grew up, and in a town called Mount Laurel, New Jersey, which has had a very complicated, long history of race, and actually was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And there was a community of Black escaped slaves that actually settled there. And so there's a long history there of, you know, back and forth periods of time where there was a lot of positive of movement and positive change, and other times where there was a lot of discrimination and horrible things that actually did happen in Mount Laurel. And I will say that, you know, it was complicated, my upbringing there. When I moved in, you know, my family was absolutely discriminated against when they were trying to move in. My sisters, however, were 5 years younger than me, around Jeff's age. I think for them it was complicated too, but it was better. Even within 5 years, it was better for them than I think it was for me. My sister, for example, like you, Jeff, was class president like 3 or 4 times, I think, too. So I think these communities, the point is that these communities change and they ebb and they flow. And sometimes they're in a better place than they are in others. And I think it's important for us never to let our guards down, because this is kind of an ongoing story, right? And depending on what period you are in time, who's there, who's living there, we all have very different experiences, I think. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about next, Christian, I know, was solutions. So I think in talking about solutions, we probably need, this is a massive problem, right? It's touching all aspects of our life, whether it be health and healthcare, or it be business, or those types of things. What we'd like to understand from the panelists is if you could kind of focus on one area of this problem, that being racism and inequity, which one do you think is the most important for us to tackle, right? There's a lot of debate at the moment about statues and symbols, and should we be focusing on removing some of these? And then there's also a lot of other people who are saying, well, actually, I really want to focus more on the areas of systemic racism that we feel are really making a fundamental difference in people's lives. So I'm curious to hear just from you, in terms of, we talk about the problem first, where within this problem do you each think we need to focus to really change things?
It's interesting. I'll take this because there's actually a case study for how the federal government and state governments can really tackle this. And Virginia is doing a fairly good job of this. And what's interesting about it is Virginia's governor, Ralph Northam, last year, if you're not familiar, was embroiled in this blackface scandal, where a conservative blog found a racist photo from his medical school yearbook. And the photo was one man in a Klan robe and the other man in blackface. Mm-hmm. And Northam initially apologized for the photo, within the next day said it wasn't him. So this became a 2 or 3 week long scandal. But he stayed in office. And the outgrowth of that was that he said he was going to spend the remainder of his term focused on racial equity work. And people heard him say that and thought, okay, well, you know, Richmond is the seat of the old Confederacy, and he might remove a Confederate statue here and might take down a flag there. And he's done those things. But he did a number of things that were really smart. The first thing he did was that he hired a chief diversity officer. And she had worked at Hampton University, this woman, Jocelyn, I'm forgetting her last name, but this is the first time that any governor has ever elevated a chief diversity officer to a cabinet level position. And so she's the one who's done a lot of the hard work and heavy lifting and hard thinking about how to address specific issues. So they tackled voting rights. They restored civil rights to felons, allowing these people to vote, to even be notary publics, to run for public office if they so choose. They tackled the issue of maternal mortality, the disparity there. Even looking at the way that race is taught in Virginia, Virginia's history, how that's taught in schools. That he set up a task force to look at that. So in that way, I think being intentional, it provides a really good case study for how to do it in a way that it hasn't really been done anywhere else that I can think of, frankly.
Motoko, Lolita, your thoughts?
Well, I would say that coming from the international perspective, I want to talk about, I would say I have sort of three issues that occur to me. One is that I'm 100% persuaded by everything that Lolita says about how even with it, not just looking at sustainability and racial equality as a goal within sustainability, but also looking at the ways in which, when we look at climate change and environmental damage, that it disproportionately affects communities of color. And I think that's not just true in New York or the United States generally. I mean, one of the things I was really shocked to read about was the fact that in Detroit, people literally didn't have water to wash their hands when the pandemic started. But I think it's true around the world. When we look at poor countries where a lot of environmental damage is occurring, it's an international problem. So I think that's one area that's not just confined to the United States, but that, you know, around the world, this is a problem. I used to be an education reporter, so that really is very close to my heart, the way in which we can try to reduce inequality by starting very early. And I think there are a lot, you know, I covered it in the United States. There's a lot of fighting over what the best way to do it is, and it's become extremely political. And it sort of saddens my heart sometimes when I was covering it to see how it seemed to be more about the politics of the adults than about caring for the children. But it's so clear, I mean, as a parent, to sort of see how fundamental what happens when they're really, really young affects how they think, how they look at the world for the rest of their lives, all into adulthood. I see that, you know, when I look back at the way that I was educated as well, you know, having been brought abroad at a young age meant that I sort of saw the world more internationally than many of my classmates who had never traveled abroad. When I went back to small, and I although I was raised in New Jersey until I was 5, actually was mostly raised in Northern California. And so I returned to Northern California after I was in Japan and could see, you know, that people who hadn't had this experience of being abroad were very confined, and it also sort of defaulted into kind of racial isolation as well. And the other thing is, because I'm in the media, I think it's really, really important. I mean, we are having a lot of introspection in our newsroom at the New York Times, where we look at, you know, part of the problem is, and I think Geoffrey said this earlier, is that newsrooms still don't represent the communities that they cover. You know, even to the point of like, it's been a long time since an Asian woman was a bureau chief in Tokyo, and that now the New York Times is much more representative. We have a lot of Asian women covering, Asian American women, I should say, covering Asia. But I think that our newsroom is still struggling with being more representative and not overwhelmingly white. You know, I know that Dean Beckey is our executive editor, which is amazing, but we still need more people of color in higher positions of power in the newsroom. We need to cultivate young talent better than we do. It's not just about recruitment, it's about cultivating and keeping people in the newsroom. And that's really, really important to me. And I worry, because of sort of the turmoil that the media is going through and how hard it is to start in media. I mean, people are paid so little when they start, that it's kind of this self-perpetuating cycle where the only people who can afford to be in media are people who have, you know, trust funds to sustain them for 10 years while they make nothing in their early jobs. I don't know if this resonates with you, Jeff, at all, but like, I feel like who exactly is supposed to work for $35,000 in New York City for even 5 years if they don't have parents who can pay for that studio apartment. So I do really worry about the sustainability of our profession and bringing young talent in. So that's something that I think about.
And Lolita, I'll give you the last word before we open it up for questions, because we want to make sure the participants get time to ask some questions.
Great. And Motoko, I just want to say I'm very good friends with Veronica Chambers. And so I hope that more voices like hers can be in positions of directing the coverage that happens at the Times. I've been a daily, or maybe the last one left, I'm a daily subscriber since 1992. So just seeing the evolution over time. I'm also friends with Nicole and just John Elegant, just seeing the wonderful coverage they've been able to do. Those Black voices really mattered. John Elegant being on the ground during Ferguson was instrumental in the coverage that you all did. So I want to applaud what you're saying and actually agree with it and hope that the Times does more of that. So I'm going to talk about a little bit from a personal perspective and from a professional perspective really quickly. So, you know, I think that we need more Black and brown people in senior leadership at climate and sustainability organizations and financial firms and corporate America in general. And that should be obvious, but I'm gonna say this because I've worked in all of those sectors. As I said, I'm 52, so I had an entirely different career on Wall Street for 14 years. I worked for Morgan Stanley for 12 years. I was actually in the building on 9/11 when it got bombed, or when it got hit by the, excuse me, I was there in 93 when it got bombed. I lost the person I was going upstairs with. That's why I'm in government now, because I left. So, but I went through a lot when I was in finance. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that for a second. I'm often the lone Black person at any of the talks and gatherings that I attend or speak at. And I'll give an example. The C40 Mayor Summit in Copenhagen, which was one of the biggest climate events that happened last year with thousands of attendees, the only Black female Americans in attendance were me and the mayor of New Orleans. And everyone kept mistaking us for each other. We made a joke about it now. We became friends because of it, but that happened. And by the way, we look nothing alike. This was also the case during the 12 years I worked for Morgan Stanley. I was the only Black female above secretary for the entire time I was there. Those things have to stop. If we're not in the room and at the table, this will not get solved. No one's asking to take anyone else's seat. Just move over and let us take our own seats. And that was not happening in my past career, hasn't been happening enough in climate, particularly when the effects of climate are hitting the least among our societies. So the US will be soon a majority minority country, and New York City is already there, 40% immigrant and majority minority. We need to start to reflect that in our leadership in all of our institutions. And for the Japanese, I would say this, being in US-Japan leadership program, I noticed that a lot of people in Japan do not have access to the experiences of Black, Latino, and other Asian backgrounds in America. So for example, 700,000 Chinese descended people live in New York City. There's about 400,000 or 300,000 maybe, or Korean. So much higher numbers and also senior elected positions. So being used to interacting with those folks to understand what motivates these leaders and how to interact and be ready to participate in how they do their leadership is really important. So it's a matter of leadership for the country itself and also how other countries and other entities interact with those leaders. The second thing I wanted to say is about my job. Green recovery is a strong component of what everyone's talking about from the city perspective as far as how we recover from COVID. So there is our city networks around the world. I'm not going to talk a lot about them, but LA, Milan, ourselves, everyone's talking to one another about how we come out of this with the monies that are coming in to be greener. And a lot of that is just transition and the desire to ensure that job creation in the fields of the future is something that's available to people who are Black and brown. So this would include job training, partnerships with the private sector, and focusing on those communities that especially need those jobs. So giving the people a chance to participate in the new opportunities such as solar panel installation, working on wind turbines, and overlay that with existing programs such as those that teach low-income New York City residents how to code. There are programs that do that for people who are high school graduates. It teaches them actually how to code. So we want to do all those things together to provide critical upskilling to help uplift those communities of color economically. So those are two things I wanted to say.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Christian, I think now we can open up to our participants to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, very, very interesting discussion. First of all, thanks everybody for joining. And it seems that already in '72, there were the first kind of integrative efforts like this busing, was it called busing initiative? Yes. Or
yes.
Yeah, and
there were many throughout history, you know, starting obviously in late 50s, kind of going through the 80s, but it was the attempt to integrate many neighborhoods around the United States.
Yeah, we had, so I I encourage now everybody, you can switch on your videos, and if you want to ask directly a question, we had only one very active commentator on the chat. It's my old friend Lauren. He's also, is it okay to say Black American or? Yes, and we actually did a business together, African American. Okay, he corrects me already.
Okay.
So Lauren, if you want to come on camera and say something, you're invited to do so.
Or anyone else.
Okay. I'm actually
Oh, sorry, can't hear very well. Breaking up.
I was just switching to the gallery view.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, hear you now.
I said I was exercising, so I'm sort of passively listening. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Any questions?
You know, the question that was given before about what do we think is the most important initiative to tackle these problems. I mean, to hear more follow-up on that would be my question, because I think we all care about different issues. So bringing our expertise to the issues that we can make the most impact on would be like, you know, obviously everyone has a different level of expertise so they can move something in the right direction. For me, I guess, my question is to all of you, I haven't lived in the States for over 20 years. I last lived in New York. And I think I said in chat that I'm from Flint. So, and in Flint, because everyone worked for the car factories, everyone had a lot of money. White people and black people both. And my parents made well over $100,000, close to $200,000 in our household when I was 12 years old, you know? So back in 1980, you know, making $150,000 a year as a black family in America was kind of unheard of, right? My mom is a medical professional, my dad worked at GM, and a lot of black families were like that. So in Flint, before the downturn, we were going to school with white kids. We were bused as well, but the white kids were bused as well. And we didn't have this kind of very strongly sort of visceral, painful discrimination thing happening. Despite that, I removed myself from the public school system to go to a private school because I felt that it wasn't going anywhere. And I could see the public school system was failing us when I was like 12. So I asked my parents to send me to a different school. So my question is, you know, if we have to start young, you know, what about education and how would you guys tackle that? You know, New York is a very big problem there because the wealthy send their kids to, you know, great schools, and the people who aren't so wealthy are stuck with the system. And I just want to bring up a certain point before I throw it to the answers. In San Francisco, where a lot of my friends lived, you know, I'm 52 as well. And a lot of my peers at Harvard, you know, Sheryl Sandberg, she's the CEO of Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg, also at Harvard, CEO of Salesforce and COO of Salesforce. These people, you know, they're all in the Bay Area, billionaires, you know, my classmates. And right now in the Bay Area, a lot of parents who have money, because they're scared to send their kids back to school with Trump's order, they're already organizing into private pooling educational units, right? You know, they're gathering up in people's rich homes, hiring expensive tutors, and homeschooling their kids in private pools. And it's organizing really, really fast, and it's gonna be done by August. So, you know, here you have a situation of wealthy people avoiding the system and giving their kids the best anyway because of the money and resources that they have. So I feel like the minority communities, not only do they not have the money and the education to even compete with that, but they also are battling the safety, the general, what's the word? I mean, in English, in Japanese, you say chian. So like chian is what? Yeah, security, like, yeah, like, you know, safety and security of their neighborhoods, right? So my question is, you know, safety and security of neighborhoods, education, how do you even get, we're never gonna get parity in this generation, right? And so, you know, what do you guys think about that? That's my question.
Okay, so Lolita and maybe Jeff.
I'll just start that, I actually am a big proponent of the charter school movement. And it's particularly robust, charter schools and community schools in New York City. So while, you know, the bulk of the children unfortunately are unable to participate, that we're chipping away at it by allowing opportunities for those things to happen. I know there was a lot of pushback in the early days of charter schools in New York City, but over the past few years has been a bigger embrace of that, as well as the community school system, because we recognize that there needs to be alternative ways for those parents to be able to get the education for their students that they need. There's a lot of back and forth now about our schools being open only part of the time, a few days a week, which is a calamity for many parents. So stay tuned on that. But I would say that, you know, New York City has 1 million school children, which is bigger than most of the sizes of many cities in the United States. It's a lot of children per year. So it's not something that's going to be solved immediately. And there's, as you know, lots of fights and arguments about how to do so. But I will say in the 30 years I've lived here, I've seen a marked uptick on the willingness to entertain other ways of making sure that the children do get educated.
Yeah, thoughts on that?
I will tell you, I don't have a good answer for the great points that you raise. I can just tell you what I've seen in my own reporting. I was just in Flint because I wanted to do a story. I wanted to check up on the kids who are now entering school, who were poisoned as babies and toddlers. And lo and behold, a number of those kids need special education because of the mental damage that was done by drinking the leaded tap water. And of course, Flint, because of all of the economic issues that have been well recorded and reported on, they don't have the resources to help these kids. And so it's the unintended consequence of the poisoned water issue. And it's just the slow rolling disaster of inequity upon inequity upon inequity. And so, you know, one of the things that's incumbent upon policymakers and lawmakers is to do that deep thinking and to think through the unintended consequences of policy decisions. And, you know, one of the reasons why the Trump administration, to take it back to my daily work, one of the reasons why the Trump administration, in fact, the only reason why they're pushing so forcefully for full-time in-person instruction is because the president wants the economy and the country to be fully reopened and to jumpstart the economy such that it can be jump-started before the election. And, you know, one of the reasons why the country is now having a resurgence of COVID is because the Trump administration made the decision early on that there would be no national plan. There'd be no national testing plan. There'd be no national contact tracing plan. There'd be no national school reopening plan, which there still isn't. Part of it is ideological because they feel like the federal government shouldn't be in the role of telling states what to do. But the other part of it is political. It's a really crass political strategy in that they didn't want to be responsible for what would happen in a Florida or in a Wisconsin or in a New York. So they said nothing and left it up to the governors. And so that is how we got this patchwork response, whereby now you have states, Republican-led states, that didn't follow the guidelines that the CDC laid out, Florida, Texas, Arizona, that are now having this resurgence because they opened too early. And so, you know, and even there, the Black and brown communities in those states too, disproportionately affected by the cases and its disproportionate death rates as well.
And Motoko, any last thoughts on the question?
Well, it's a huge question. You know, you asked a lot about education, and I agree with Lolita that there's a lot of interesting work coming out of the charter movement. When I was covering education, you know, one of the things I was alluding to was the sort of politicization of it. And, you know, there are plenty of legitimate criticisms that can be leveled at some charter schools, not all. But it always felt to me when I was covering it that it came from this sort of, everyone sort of jumped to their ideological corners, and that there were kind of political reasons for people making criticisms. And if there were two sides, if you will, the sort of pro and con charter, you know, to just select one aspect of education, public education in the United States, it felt often that there was a sort of entrenched group that was not willing to be open-minded to new ideas and experimentation, that just the very fact of the existence of these charter schools was offensive to them without even sort of looking at the data or looking at the experience or talking to people who had gone through that there was just a sort of knee-jerk ideological objection. You know, in fairness, there are people who support charter schools who also have some knee-jerk ideological objections to certain things that happen in public schools, say among teachers unions. But if there could be a plea, and I think this is probably goes for beyond education, but like as a journalist, like my professional job is to kind of be open-minded to the evidence, right? Like talk to people, get the evidence, canvas experience. You know, it seems like there could be a lot of good ideas that come from people that you don't necessarily agree with, and sort of Lolita has alluded to a lot of the sort of objections to the charter school movement in New York. It didn't seem that it always came from people who had any experience of the charter movement at all. They just had heard from someone who had told them that they should be politically against it, and they didn't want to hear anything about it. And that doesn't really seem to be a great way to help improve society. Like you have to listen to different ideas and be open to new ideas. And, you know, I know that in my work as a reporter that, you know, our job is to go into a situation as much as possible to be open to what we hear, you know, go with a blank reporter's notebook and not go with a blank mind. Obviously come with your own biases and cultural background and previous experience and previous reporting, but also be open to hearing what people are going to tell you. And that seems like a great principle to live by, you know, in many aspects of life, including policy development.
Just to piggyback off what Motoko said, I would advise people to think about watching something called Waiting for Superman. It's now, what, 10, 12 years old, maybe 10 years old. But it's a movie about the charter school movement with a person named Eva Moskowitz, who founded Success Academies. And it juxtaposed what Motoko's saying about the sort of rhetoric of people saying we're against this for very ideological reasons, and the parents who cried when their children did not get in. And these were low income. This was like their last shot they felt to get their child a really great education. So juxtaposing how the parents actually felt about getting their children a chance to do this versus the ideology that came behind it. It's just a great documentary that really illuminated for me.
Great. That was a really fantastic discussion.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah.
So Christian, now shall we move into our breakout groups, or what would you like to do?
Yeah, I think it's the time is always it's faster than you expect. There were so many good ideas which have been discussed. Just one thing I wanted to add is that, and which we also want to discuss in these breakout rooms. Everything has to start actually from ourselves. So we have to be able to connect to ourselves, and we have to be able to connect to other people, and always remain open, and always be willing to learn from others, and to accept that there are other opinions, to accept that there is other ways of living. And if we actually embrace the otherness of people, and we form this into our organizations, into our daily life, we can probably feel very quickly that it will have an effect, and it starts from being compassionate with the other people. And also for innovation, which I'm active in, it's very important to have diversity in a team, and that if you don't have different opinions, if you don't have openness in the team, there will be something which would be suppressed and which doesn't come out, and then it doesn't lead to the same kind of result. So I would like to try to go into this breakout sessions now. We have 18 participants watching left. We give everybody 10 minutes, and I think we have about 3 to 4 groups, and it will be randomly divided. And the 3 questions which we already mentioned in the beginning: what can we do on the individual level? What can we do in our organizations where we work, in our companies or in our workplaces? And the third one, again, Trista, was what is the ideal image for the future of what does inclusion ideally look like in an ideal society of the future.